Anywhere else, flatlines mean disaster. In our operating room, they were the plan. A 35-year-old woman. Brain surgery at the edge of what medicine can do. A Thursday case that had already pushed every skill I had. But as I watched her brainwave screen hold a straight line, the heart monitor stay silent, and her body temperature dropped to 60 degrees, there was no checklist for what came next. For the next 45 minutes, my patient would be clinically dead. And that's when this became the most inexplicable case of my career. I had been practicing anesthesiology for 15 years when this case landed on my schedule, and I thought I understood the boundaries between consciousness and unconsciousness as well as anyone in the field. I had put thousands of patients under general anesthesia, had managed everything from routine surgeries to emergency trauma cases, had dealt with every complication from malignant hyperthermia to anesthesia awareness. But nothing in my training had prepared me for a patient who could watch her own brain surgery while showing no signs of life on any monitor we had. The patient was a professional singer who had walked into the emergency room 3 weeks earlier, complaining of severe headaches, dizziness, and episodes where she temporarily lost the ability to speak. A CT scan revealed what every neurologist fears seeing: a massive cerebral aneurysm positioned at the worst possible location where the brain's major blood vessels converge. The aneurysm was described as a giant, medical terminology for a bulge in the artery wall so large that it could rupture at any moment, causing instant death. The neurosurgeon who consulted on the case was blunt about the patient's options. She's going to die. The only question is whether it happens in the next few days when the aneurysm ruptures, or whether we can give her a fighting chance with the most radical procedure in neurosurgery. That procedure was something called hypothermic cardiac arrest, nicknamed Operation Standstill by the surgical team. It was the kind of surgery that happened maybe once or twice a year at our hospital, requiring a team of over 20 specialists and equipment that most medical centers didn't even possess. The concept was as simple as it was terrifying. We would stop the patient's heart, drain all the blood from her brain, and lower her body temperature so dramatically that she would be clinically dead for nearly an hour while the surgeon worked. As the anesthesiologist assigned to the case, my job was arguably the most challenging. I had to bring this woman to the very edge of death and hold her there, maintaining the delicate balance between preserving her brain tissue and providing the surgeon with the bloodless operative field he needed to safely clip the aneurysm. "Are you sure about this?" I asked the neurosurgeon during our preoperative meeting. "The margin for error is essentially zero. If something goes wrong during the standstill period, there's no coming back." "If we don't do this, she's dead within a week," he replied. "The aneurysm is too large and too unstable for any conventional approach. This is her only chance." The patient herself was surprisingly calm when I met with her the evening before surgery. Most people facing this kind of procedure would be terrified, but she seemed to have a peaceful acceptance about what was to come. "Doctor, I need to ask you something," she said, as I finished explaining the anesthetic plan. "Is there any chance I'll be aware during the surgery? I've heard stories about people waking up during operations." I had given this speech hundreds of times before, but never for a case quite like this one. Under normal circumstances, the anesthesia we'll be using would make awareness impossible. But I have to be honest with you. This isn't a normal surgery. You'll be so deeply anesthetized and hypothermic that your brain activity will be undetectable. If consciousness exists in the brain the way we understand it, then you'll have no awareness whatsoever. And if consciousness doesn't work the way we understand it? It was an odd question, and I remember pausing before answering. Then I suppose we'll both learn something new about the nature of human awareness. The surgery was scheduled to begin at 7:30 a.m. I arrived at the hospital at 5:30 to review the anesthetic plan one final time and check all the specialized equipment we would need. This wasn't just about keeping someone unconscious. I had to coordinate the cooling and rewarming process, manage the transition to and from cardiopulmonary bypass, and monitor brain function with instruments sensitive enough to detect the faintest electrical activity. The operating room had been specially configured for the procedure. In addition to the standard anesthetic monitors, we had continuous EEG monitoring to track brain waves, brainstem auditory evoked response testing to monitor deeper brain function, and temperature probes that could measure core body temperature to within 1/10 of a degree. When the patient arrived in the OR, I began the most complex anesthetic induction of my career. First came the standard medications: propofol for unconsciousness, fentanyl for pain control, and vecuronium to paralyze her muscles. But then came the specialized preparation that set this case apart from anything else in medicine. I inserted small molded speakers directly into both of her ear canals, secured them with gauze, and began playing rapid clicking sounds at 100 decibels, roughly equivalent to standing next to a jackhammer. These clicks would allow us to monitor her brainstem function throughout the procedure. If she retained even the slightest awareness, the brainstem would respond to these auditory stimuli and show up on our monitors. Her eyes were lubricated and taped shut to prevent damage during the long procedure. EEG electrodes were placed across her scalp to monitor cortical brain activity. A specialized probe was inserted to test the function of her cerebral hemispheres. Every possible method of detecting consciousness was employed. At 8:45 a.m., the surgeon began opening her skull with a high-speed bone saw that produced a distinctive high-pitched whining sound. I watched my monitors carefully, blood pressure stable, heart rate controlled, EEG showing the deep, slow waves of general anesthesia. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. By 10:30 a.m., we were ready for the most dangerous phase of the operation. The patient was connected to the heart-lung bypass machine, and we began the careful process of cooling her body. I watched her core temperature drop degree by degree: 98.6, tonura 80, 70. As her temperature fell, her heart rate slowed, her brain waves became more suppressed, and her body entered a state unlike anything in normal human experience. At 60 degrees Fahrenheit, her heart stopped beating on its own. The EEG went completely flat, not the slow waves of deep anesthesia, but the absolute silence of a brain without electrical activity. The brainstem monitors showed no response to the clicking sounds. Every test we had for detecting consciousness indicated that there was nobody home. "Commencing circulatory arrest," announced the perfusionist. The heart-lung machine was turned off, and the blood began draining from the patient's body. Her brain, now empty of blood and registering no electrical activity, was as close to death as any living person had ever been. For the next 45 minutes, I maintained constant vigilance over a patient who showed no signs of life. No heartbeat, no brain waves, no response to any stimulus. The temperature in the room felt cold despite the warming blankets we used to prevent hypothermia in the surgical team. There was something deeply unsettling about managing the anesthesia for someone who was, by every medical definition, dead. The surgeon worked quickly and precisely in the bloodless operative field. With no circulation to obscure his view, he could see the aneurysm clearly for the first time. It was even larger than the scans had suggested, a balloon of tissue so thin it was translucent. One wrong move, one moment of bleeding, and it would have been impossible to repair. At 11:45 a.m., the surgeon successfully placed a titanium clip across the neck of the aneurysm. "Got it," he announced. "Time to bring her back." The rewarming process was as delicate as the cooling had been. The heart-lung machine was restarted, pumping warm blood back into her body. I watched her temperature climb slowly, 65, 70, 75. As her body warmed, I began to see the first signs of returning life. Faint electrical activity appeared on the EEG. Her heart, stimulated by the warming blood, began to beat irregularly. At 85 degrees, I gave her heart a controlled electrical shock to restore normal rhythm. The monitors came alive with the reassuring patterns of a functioning cardiovascular system. Brain waves returned, first as slow delta waves, then gradually showing the patterns of emerging consciousness. The surgery was completed at 2:15 p.m., 7 hours after we had begun, and nearly an hour after she had been clinically dead. The patient was stable and showing normal vital signs. The aneurysm had been successfully clipped, and preliminary tests suggested no neurological damage from the extended period without circulation. I expected her recovery to be slow and difficult. Patients who underwent this procedure typically spent days in intensive care, often with confusion, memory problems, and other neurological effects from the trauma of controlled death and resurrection. But this patient was different from the start. She woke up in the recovery room more alert and oriented than most patients who had undergone routine surgery. Her first words were remarkably coherent. "Doctor, I need to tell you about what I experienced during the operation." I assumed she was referring to dreams or hallucinations from the anesthesia, a common occurrence that I usually dismissed as the brain's attempt to process the chemical and physiological stress of surgery. "What do you remember?" I asked, more out of courtesy than medical interest. "I remember everything," she said. "I watched the entire surgery." This got my attention. Anesthesia awareness during routine surgery was rare but possible. Anesthesia awareness during hypothermic cardiac arrest with flat EEG and no brain circulation should have been impossible. "Tell me what you think you remember," I said, pulling up a chair beside her bed. I heard the bone saw start up. It made a very specific sound, like a dental drill, but higher pitched. The sound was in D natural. I paused. She was right about the sound, and the musical reference was oddly specific. But patients sometimes incorporated real sounds from surgery into their dreams or hallucinations. "What else do you remember?" I could see the saw itself. It looked like an electric toothbrush, but much larger. The case it came from looked like a mechanic's socket wrench set with different attachments for different parts of the skull. Now I was paying closer attention. The Midas Rex bone saw we used did indeed resemble an oversized electric toothbrush, and it did come in a case with interchangeable cutting attachments. These weren't details a patient would know unless they had seen medical equipment before. I also heard the surgeon talking about my blood vessels. He said something about my arteries and veins being smaller than expected, and that they were going to have to use a different approach for the bypass cannulation. My mouth went dry. This conversation had indeed taken place, but it happened while she was already under deep anesthesia, with flat brain waves and no circulation. There was no possible way she could have heard it through conventional sensory channels. "Where were you when you heard this conversation?" I asked. "I was floating above the operating table watching everything. I could see my body lying there, but I felt completely detached from it. It was like watching a movie of someone else's surgery." Over the next hour, she provided details about the surgery that were impossible for her to know. She described the specific instruments used, the conversations between surgical team members, and even the music that had been playing in the background, a classical piece that the surgeon preferred during complex procedures. At one point, someone came in and told you that they couldn't find a good pulse in my groin for the arterial line. They had to try the other side. This had happened exactly as she described, during the period when she was clinically dead. The detail was mentioned in the surgical notes, but it wasn't something that would have been discussed in front of a conscious patient, and it certainly wasn't something she could have observed while under anesthesia with no brain circulation. I spent the next several days investigating her claims, cross-referencing her memories with the surgical records, the anesthesia documentation, and interviews with every member of the surgical team. Every detail she provided was accurate. More disturbing, many of the details she remembered were conversations and events that occurred during the 45-minute period when she was clinically dead. "How do you explain this?" asked the neurosurgeon when I shared my findings with him. "Everything we know about consciousness tells us that awareness requires a functioning brain. She had no brain activity for nearly an hour." I had no explanation. The patient's experience violated every principle of neuroscience and anesthesiology that I had learned in 15 years of practice. Consciousness, as we understood it, was a product of brain activity. No brain activity meant no consciousness. Yet she had somehow maintained awareness and formed memories during a period when her brain was essentially off. But her experience went beyond just observing the surgery. During the deepest part of the procedure, when her body temperature was at its lowest and she had been without circulation for over 30 minutes, she described a different kind of experience altogether. "I felt like I was being pulled away from the operating room," she told me during one of our follow-up conversations. It wasn't frightening, more like being gently drawn towards something. I found myself in what seemed like a tunnel, but not a physical tunnel. It was more like a space between spaces. "What did you see in this tunnel?" "Light, but not like any light I've ever seen. It was warm and welcoming, and it seemed to be alive somehow. As I moved toward it, I began to see figures in the light, people I recognized." "Who did you see?" "My grandmother, who died when I was 12. My uncle, who passed away 10 years ago. They seemed to be waiting for me, but also protecting me somehow. My grandmother was the one who told me I had to go back." "What do you mean, go back?" "She said it wasn't my time yet, that I had work to finish. I didn't want to leave. The feeling of peace and love was unlike anything I've ever experienced. But she was insistent that I return to my body." "Do you remember coming back?" "I remember my uncle guiding me back through the tunnel, back toward the operating room. I could see my body on the table, and I really didn't want to get back into it. It looked so pale and lifeless. But then I felt like I was being pushed, and suddenly I was back inside, feeling cold and heavy and uncomfortable." The timing of her return corresponded exactly with the moment when we had rewarmed her body enough to restart her heart and restore circulation to her brain. She had no way of knowing when this occurred, yet her subjective experience matched the objective medical timeline perfectly. I found myself in the uncomfortable position of having to reconcile scientific materialism with an experience that seemed to transcend physical reality. As an anesthesiologist, my entire professional identity was built on the understanding that consciousness was a product of brain chemistry and electrical activity. Adjust the chemistry, and you adjust consciousness. Stop the electrical activity, and consciousness disappears. Yet, here was a patient who had maintained not only awareness, but enhanced awareness during a period of complete brain shutdown. She had observed details of her surgery that should have been impossible to perceive, and she had experienced what could only be described as a journey beyond physical reality. The case haunted me for months afterward. I found myself questioning fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between mind and brain, and the possibility that human awareness might exist independently of neural activity. I began researching similar cases and discovered that this patient's experience, while rare, was not unique. There were documented reports of patients who had gained consciousness during periods of cardiac arrest, during deep anesthesia, and even during procedures like the one I had just managed. The medical literature contained case studies that were dismissed by most practitioners, but that described experiences remarkably similar to what my patient had reported. More disturbing was the realization that if consciousness could persist during clinical death, how many patients had we lost who might have been aware of our efforts to save them? How many people declared dead had actually remained conscious, trapped in unresponsive bodies, aware of everything happening around them? The patient's recovery was remarkable. Despite the trauma of controlled death and resurrection, she showed no neurological deficits. Her cognitive function was normal, her personality was unchanged, and the aneurysm repair was completely successful. But she was transformed by her experience in ways that went beyond the physical healing. "I'm not afraid of death anymore," she told me during a follow-up visit 6 months after the surgery. I know that sounds strange, but having been there and come back, I understand that death isn't an ending. It's a transition to something else, something beautiful. Has the experience affected your daily life? Everything feels more vivid now, more meaningful. I appreciate simple things in a way I never did before. And I have this persistent sense that we're all connected to something larger than ourselves. She had returned to her singing career, but her music had taken on a different quality. She wrote songs about her experience, about the nature of consciousness and the continuity of existence beyond physical death. Her audiences responded to something in her performance that hadn't been there before, a depth and authenticity that seemed to come from having touched something beyond ordinary human experience. A year after the surgery, I attended one of her concerts. As she sang about light and love and the journey beyond physical reality, I found myself thinking about the implications of her experience for everything I thought I knew about medicine and consciousness. The case forced me to confront the limitations of materialist explanations for human awareness. If consciousness was truly just a product of brain activity, then my patient's experience should have been impossible. Yet it had happened. With multiple witnesses and documented verification of details she couldn't have known through normal sensory channels. I began to consider the possibility that consciousness might be more than just an emergent property of neural complexity. Perhaps the brain acted more like a receiver or translator of consciousness rather than its generator. Perhaps what we called death was simply the disconnection of consciousness from its physical interface, not the extinction of awareness itself. These weren't comfortable thoughts for someone trained in the scientific method and committed to evidence-based medicine. But the evidence in this case pointed toward conclusions that challenged the fundamental assumptions of modern neuroscience. 3 years after the surgery, I was invited to present the case at a medical conference on consciousness and anesthesia. The audience was skeptical, as I had been before experiencing this case firsthand. The questions were predictable. Could she have heard conversations during lighter phases of anesthesia? Could her memories have been constructed from fragments of real sensory input? Could the entire experience have been an elaborate confabulation? I had considered all these possibilities and found them inadequate to explain the totality of her experience. The verification of specific details during the period of clinical death, the correspondence between her subjective experience and the objective medical timeline, and the transformation in her personality and outlook all pointed toward something more than hallucination or false memory construction. "Are you suggesting that consciousness can exist independently of brain function?" asked one of the attendees. "I'm suggesting that this case challenges our current understanding of the relationship between consciousness and brain activity," I replied. "Whether that means consciousness exists independently of the brain, or whether it means we don't understand how the brain generates consciousness, I can't say. But we can't ignore evidence just because it doesn't fit our current paradigms." The case continued to influence my practice in unexpected ways. I became more attentive to patients' reports of unusual experiences during surgery. I started asking different questions during post-operative visits. And I found that experiences like my patients', while rare, were not as uncommon as the medical literature suggested. Many patients had simply never reported their experiences, assuming that no one would believe them or that they were products of anesthesia-induced hallucinations. Others had been dismissed by medical staff who were uncomfortable with accounts that challenged conventional understanding of consciousness and death. I began to keep detailed records of any unusual experiences reported by my patients, building a database of cases that seemed to involve awareness during periods when consciousness should have been impossible. The patterns that emerged suggested that human awareness might be far more resilient and independent than we had assumed. 5 years after the original surgery, the patient contacted me with news that would add another layer to the mystery of her case. She had been experiencing what she described as enhanced intuitive abilities since her recovery, an increased sensitivity to other people's emotional states, occasional dreams that seemed to predict future events, and a general sense of being more connected to some kind of universal consciousness. "I don't know if this is related to what happened during the surgery," she said, but it feels like that experience opened some kind of door that I can't close. Not that I would want to close it. These abilities have made my life richer and more meaningful. But I thought you should know in case other patients report similar changes. This revelation added another dimension to the case that I hadn't anticipated. If near-death experiences during surgical procedures could result in lasting changes to consciousness and perception, then we needed to consider not just the immediate medical implications, but the long-term effects on patients' cognitive and perceptual abilities. I began following up with other patients who had reported unusual experiences during surgery and found that many of them described similar changes: enhanced empathy, increased creativity, occasional precognitive experiences, and a persistent sense of being connected to something beyond ordinary reality. These findings suggested that what we called anesthesia awareness might be more complex than simple sensory perception during inadequate sedation. Perhaps some patients were accessing levels of consciousness that we didn't yet understand or couldn't measure with our current instruments. The implications for anesthesiology were profound. If consciousness could persist during clinical death, if awareness could transcend the normal boundaries of neural activity, then we needed to reconsider our entire approach to managing patient consciousness during surgery. I started incorporating new protocols into my practice, treating every patient as potentially aware, regardless of what our monitors indicated. I began talking to patients during surgery, explaining what was happening and providing reassurance even when they appeared completely unconscious. If there was any chance that some part of their awareness persisted, I wanted that awareness to be comforted rather than terrified. The patient's case became a turning point in my career and my understanding of human consciousness. It forced me to abandon the comfortable certainties of materialist medicine and embrace a more humble appreciation for the mysteries of awareness and identity. 10 years after her surgery, she remained healthy and vibrant, with no recurrence of her aneurysm and no neurological complications from the procedure. But more importantly, she had become an advocate for the recognition and study of consciousness beyond the brain. She spoke at medical conferences, wrote about her experience, and worked with researchers who were investigating the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical brain function. Her case had become part of a growing body of evidence, suggesting that human awareness might be far more complex and resilient than conventional neuroscience assumed. "What do you think your experience means for medicine?" I asked her during our most recent follow-up visit. "I think it means we need to be more humble about what we think we know," she replied. "Medicine has made incredible advances in understanding and treating the physical body, but consciousness remains a mystery. My experience suggests that mystery might be deeper and more wonderful than we've imagined." As I reflected on her case and its impact on my practice, I realized that it had fundamentally changed not just my approach to anesthesiology, but my understanding of what it means to be human. If consciousness could survive clinical death, if awareness could transcend the apparent boundaries of brain function, then human beings might be far more than just complex biological machines. The case reminded me that medicine at its best was not just about treating disease, but about honoring the full mystery of human existence. And sometimes, the most important lessons came not from textbooks or research studies, but from patients who experienced something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the nature of life and death. Today, whenever I induce anesthesia for a complex procedure, I remember the patient who watched her own brain surgery from outside her body. I remember that consciousness might be more resilient and mysterious than our instruments can measure. And I remember that every patient I treat carries the same potential for experiences that transcend our current understanding of what it means to be alive and aware. Her case taught me that the boundary between life and death, between consciousness and unconsciousness, might be far more permeable than we had ever imagined. And in a profession dedicated to healing and preserving life, that lesson continues to inform every decision I make and every patient I treat.